Good morning. It's Sunday, December 29th. And this morning I'm going to talk a little bit about history. Now, normally, when I think of history, I think of ancient times or the revolution that took place in this country in the 1700s or something like that. But this history that I'm about to talk about is something that I lived through. And you out there may not have lived through it, but I am sure that your parents or your grandparents also lived through this same period of time as I'm referring to in this episode. It's a point of life that I lived through as a child, and that many of my friends lived through too. And I wonder how many of them consider that part of history. And this is something that took place during World War II. And that was a time of great strife in this country. Because immediate, as soon as the war had started, the country that we lived in turned into a production factory for our armed forces. And many of the things that we, as people, as citizens who were staying home and not in the fight, for instance, had to contribute by something that was known as rationing. The food supply was reduced for the public to some infinitesimal amounts. Like you were only allowed like a quarter of a pound of sugar per month or something like that. Some ridiculous number that we couldn't all live on. So what did we do? Well, what we did is we created a new form of an energy supply. It was known as the Victory God. And this came about because of the new problem that emerged in 1942. The problem was, of course, the food shortages. Most of the commercial crops were sent overseas to the troops. And anything that was left over couldn't be distributed to the civilians around the country because there were wartime chain complications. And food rationing was implemented to remedy the situation. But that didn't do much to help the hungry people that were living in this country. But we, as a strong nation, figured out what to do. And it was the Victory God. And it turned out that during that time of strife in this country, school grounds, vacant lots, backyards were transformed into what they called bountiful gardens, which of course got the name of the Victory God. And Victory Gardens were very big during World War II, even though they had appeared a little bit during World War I. And the government heavily promoted the Victory God with propaganda posters and messages. And Victory Gardens weren't really forced upon people. They weren't mandated, but many Americans loved the idea of a Victory Garden. They viewed that as a patriotic duty, and it didn't take long for Victory Gardens to spring up around the country during the beginning of World War II. And it was producing carrots and kale and lettuce and beans and cabbage and many other veggies. And the gardens came in all sizes and shapes. They were window boxes that people had in their home. There were little plots of land out in front of the building. There were people who had tomato plants growing in their backyard. There were large community plots that many families contributed to. And during World War II, every single bit of this helped. And by 1944, a year before the end of the war, there were an estimated 20 million victory gardens around the country, and they were producing around 8 billion tons of food for the U.S. troops and for the civilian population. And even Eleanor Roosevelt, who was the first lady of this country, planted a victory garden on the White House lawn. And so when you look back and you think about some of the things that we lived through, my generation, we must remember the victory garden, a sign of greatness. And when I think about the victory garden in terms of what's going on in this country today and how we have lost sight of gathering together for the great fight, we are falling apart at the seams in this country. So I urge everybody to think about 1944 when there were victory gardens and everybody contributed to the welfare of this country. We've come a long way, baby, and it hasn't been great. And it isn't great right now, given that we are split so far asunder in our thinking here. And who knows what's going to happen in the next 4 years when Donald Trump takes over. So I leave you with that great thought. Victory gardens and how this country came together to fight our enemies by feeding ourselves and feeding the troops. It's time for us to reach that type of community again. So I leave you with that this morning. Have a great day. Bye.